mean I'll see it.
I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the back of a woman I had never seen before in my life. She was wearing a faded floral robe, the kind that looks soft from a decade of wash cycles, and she was humming a tune that felt familiar but didn't belong to any song I knew. She turned around, saw me, and gave me this warm, effortless smile that only comes from years of shared mornings. She told me to hurry up or I'd be late for the presentation I'd been stressing over all week. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was lined with dry sand. I just looked past her at the refrigerator. It was covered in those colorful plastic alphabet magnets and a dozen Polaroids. In every single photo, there I was. I was at a beach holding a toddler with chubby legs. I was at a Christmas party with a glass of eggnog, my arm wrapped around this stranger's waist. I looked happy. I looked like I belonged there. But I didn't remember the beach, I didn't remember the party, and I definitely didn't remember having a daughter. I managed to mumble something about needing to use the shower and practically bolted down the hallway. I found the bathroom by instinct, which was the most terrifying part. My body knew exactly which door to open and where the light switch was, even though my brain was screaming that I had never been in this house before. I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled my wallet out of my pocket. It was my face on the license, no doubt about it. The same slightly crooked nose, the same tired eyes. But the name was different. The address was for this house, a place on a street I didn't recognize in a town I didn't think I'd ever visited. I felt a thick, suffocating pressure in my chest, a sensation of being buried alive under the weight of a life that wasn't mine. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and pulled out my phone. My thumb moved automatically to the passcode, a sequence of numbers I'd never used before today, yet my muscles remembered them perfectly. I opened social media and started scrolling. There were hundreds of photos. Me at a wedding. Me holding a newborn in a hospital room. The captions were full of I love yous and inside jokes that meant absolutely nothing to me. According to the digital trail, I had been living this life for over 10 years. I saw a post from 3 years ago about us moving into this forever home. A soft knock came at the door. It wasn't loud, but it made me jump so hard I nearly dropped the phone. It was the woman. She asked if I was feeling okay, her voice laced with a kind of genuine concern that made my skin crawl. She called me by that name on the ID, David. I stayed silent for a moment, watching her shadow move under the doorframe. I finally told her I just had a bit of an upset stomach. She told me she'd put some ginger tea out for me and that she'd woken the kids up. I waited until I heard her walk away before I stood up and looked in the mirror. I started checking my body. I had a scar on my forearm, a jagged white line I'd never seen before. I touched it, and a flash of a memory hit me, falling off a bike onto a gravel path, but it felt like a movie I'd watched once, not something that had happened to me. I eventually forced myself to leave the bathroom. I had to see the kids. I walked into the dining area, and there they were. A boy, maybe 7, and the girl from the photos, about 5. They looked up from their cereal and greeted me with a casual warning, Dad. They didn't even look twice. To them, I was the same man who had tucked them in the night before. I sat down at the head of the table. The woman, her name was Sarah. I found that on a piece of mail by the toaster, placed a mug in front of me. As she leaned over, I caught the scent of her perfume. It was something floral and sharp, and for a split second, a wave of absolute nausea hit me. I looked down at my hands and realized they were slightly stained with something dark under the fingernails. I rubbed them under the table, trying to scrape the grime away. That's when I noticed the basement door. It was slightly ajar, just a sliver of darkness peering through the bright, cherry yellow of the kitchen walls. A faint, metallic tang hung in the air coming from that direction. It didn't smell like copper, it smelled like an old, rusted playground after a rainstorm, mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent of raw meat left out on a counter. It was a thick, cloying odor that seemed to stick to the back of my throat. Sarah noticed me looking. Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes went very still. She told me I shouldn't worry about the leak in the cellar, that she'd call someone to look at it while I was at work. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her skin was unnaturally cold, like she'd been holding ice cubes, and she squeezed just a little too hard. "You're not going anywhere, David," she said. The way she said it wasn't a threat, at least not on the surface. It was stated like a fundamental law of physics. Like gravity. I spent the rest of the day in a trance. I went to the office listed on my calendar. People waved at me. I sat through a meeting about logistics, nodding when people looked at me, terrified that one wrong word would shatter the illusion. I felt like an actor who had been shoved onto a stage without a script, knowing that the audience would tear him apart if he missed a single cue. When I got home that evening, the house was quiet. The kids were supposedly at a sleepover. Sarah was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a long, thin knife. The sound of the blade hitting the wooden board was rhythmic and steady. Thump, thump, thump. "I fixed the smell in the basement," she said without turning around. I didn't ask how. I walked toward the basement door, drawn by a morbid, sickening curiosity that I couldn't suppress. I needed to know who I had replaced. I needed to know where the man who actually owned this face had gone. I pushed the door open. The light wouldn't turn on, so I used the flashlight on my phone. The stairs were steep and narrow. The smell was stronger here, that wet, iron-heavy scent that makes your stomach turn. I reached the bottom and panned the light around. The basement was mostly empty, just some storage bins and a workbench. But in the far corner, the concrete floor looked different. It was darker, as if it had been recently scrubbed, but the stains had soaked deep into the porous surface. I moved closer. There, tucked behind a stack of old tires, was a pile of clothes. They were soaked through, stiff and dark. I recognized the shirt. It was the one I saw myself wearing in the Christmas photo on the fridge. Beside the clothes was a wedding ring, identical to the one I was now wearing on my own finger. I heard the basement door creak at the top of the stairs. I looked up. Sarah was standing there, silhouetted by the kitchen light. She wasn't holding the knife anymore, but she was leaning against the frame in a way that felt predatory. "He wasn't a very good husband, you know," she whispered. Her voice carried perfectly in the damp silence of the cellar. "He didn't appreciate what he had. He wanted to leave us. He thought he could just walk away from 10 years of history." She started walking down the stairs, one slow step at a time. The wood groaned under her weight. "But you're different," she continued. "You're much better at this. You have his face, you have his memories, even if you haven't found them all yet. They'll come back to you. They always do." I backed away into the darkness, my heels hitting the cold concrete wall. "Who am I?" I managed to choke out. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into the beam of my flashlight. Her face was calm, almost loving. "You're whoever I need you to be. And you're going to stay David for a long, long time. Because if you stop being David, well, there's plenty of room under the floorboards for another shirt. I've been in this house for 3 years now. I go to work. I play with the kids. I kiss Sarah goodnight. Every morning I wake up and look at the photos, and every morning the memories feel a little bit more real. I can almost remember the beach now. I can almost remember the wedding. But sometimes, when it's late at night and the house is silent, I find myself standing in front of the basement door. I can still smell that rusted, white iron scent creeping up through the cracks. I look at my hands and I wonder how many other Davids are buried under this house, and how long it will be before I stop being a good enough husband and she decides it's time for a new one to wake up in my bed. I can't leave. I have nowhere to go. My old life, Whoever I was before that morning is completely gone. There are no records of me. No one is looking for me. I am a ghost inhabiting a dead man's life, trapped in a suburban nightmare with a woman who watches me sleep to make sure I don't try to remember the truth.
Next story.
My mother used to say that some things are meant to be kept in the family, tucked away under the floorboards where the world couldn't stain them. We spoke a version of Italian that didn't exist in any textbook. It was thick, rhythmic, and full of strange, sharp vowels that felt like they were carved out of the mountain air where my great-grandparents were born. It was the first way I learned to describe the world. When I was a kid, that language felt like a physical weight in my mouth, something solid and safe that belonged only to us. I was sitting in my apartment, just a normal afternoon with the sun hitting the dust motes in the air, when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I picked up, expecting the usual check-in about my job or what I was eating for dinner. She started speaking immediately, her voice carrying that familiar, melodic cadence she always had. But as she spoke, something inside my head just shifted. It wasn't like she was speaking a different language. It was like the audio track of my life had suddenly been replaced with something wrong. I heard the sounds, the rising and falling of her tone, but the meaning was gone. It sounded like the rhythmic scraping of a knife against a whetstone, or the wet, tearing sound of someone pulling apart raw meat. It was melodic, sure, but it was just noise. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the screen, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I thought maybe it was a bad connection, or that she was having a stroke. "Ma?" I said, and my own voice felt thin and fragile. She responded, and this time, the sound was even worse. It was a series of guttural clicks and long, drawn-out hisses that I knew, deep in my soul, were supposed to be words of endearment. I tried to think of the word for hello or mother in our dialect. I could see the shape of the word in my mind, a ghostly outline of a memory, but when I tried to grab it, it dissolved into nothing. It was like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Every single word of my first language, the foundation of my entire childhood, had been scrubbed clean from my brain. I remember standing there in the kitchen, the silence of the room feeling massive and suffocating. My mother was still talking on the other end, her voice becoming more urgent, more frantic. I could hear the desperation in those alien sounds, the way she was begging for me to answer, but I couldn't. I just stood there, listening to the static where my identity used to be. The next few weeks were a blur of sterile white rooms and the smell of antiseptic that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. I went to a neurologist, then another, then a specialist who dealt with rare cognitive glitches. They ran every test they had. They shoved me into the humming tunnel of an MRI machine, the magnets clicking like teeth around my skull. They took vials of my blood, the liquid looking dark and almost black in the flickering fluorescent light of the lab. They told me there was nothing wrong. No stroke, no tumor, no hidden trauma. Physically, my brain was a perfect, healthy organ. But I knew better. It didn't feel like a medical problem. It felt like a theft. I tried to go back to my parents' house a month later. I thought maybe if I was in the environment where I grew up, if I smelled the rosemary and the old wood of the banister, the words would come back. My father met me at the door. He looked older, more tired, his skin sagging in a way that made him look like he was melting into his clothes. He hugged me, and he whispered something into my ear. It was a wet, clicking sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I pulled away, looking at him, and for a second, his face didn't look right. His eyes were too wide, the pupils blown out until there was almost no color left, just two black pits reflecting my own terrified face. He kept talking, his mouth moving in ways that seemed physically impossible for a human jaw. The sounds were thick and moist, like someone stepping through deep mud. I walked into the kitchen and saw my mother. She was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled metallic and sharp, a scent that caught in my sinuses and made my eyes water. It wasn't the smell of food. It smelled like a butcher shop after a long day, that raw, primal scent of exposed muscle and salt. She turned to me and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She started talking, and the sound was like a swarm of insects buzzing in a closed room. I realized then that it wasn't just that I had forgotten the language. It was that the language itself was changing. Or maybe it was finally showing me what it actually was. I stayed in my old bedroom that night, the one with the cracked wallpaper and the window that rattled in the wind. I couldn't sleep. The house felt like it was breathing around me. From the hallway, I could hear my parents talking in the living room. Without the filter of understanding, their conversation sounded like a ritual. There were long silences followed by rhythmic, chanting sounds that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the frame of my bed. I got up and crept to the door, peering through the slight gap in the wood. The lights were off, but the moon was bright enough to cast long, distorted shadows across the hallway. My parents were sitting on the sofa, side by side. They weren't looking at each other. They were staring straight ahead at the dark television screen. Their mouths were moving in perfect unison, producing a low, vibrating hum that made my teeth ache. Then my mother reached out and took my father's hand. She didn't just hold it. She began to peel the skin back from his knuckles with her fingernails, her movements slow and deliberate. He didn't flinch. He didn't stop humming. She kept talking in that clicking, whistling tone, and as the skin tore away, exposing the glistening red beneath, she leaned in and licked the wound. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. I scrambled back into bed and pulled the covers over my head, praying for morning. I didn't leave my room until the sun was high in the sky. When I finally came downstairs, my parents were sitting at the kitchen table, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. My father's hand was bandaged, a small bloom of red seeping through the white gauze. "Accident with the bread knife," he said, or at least, that's what his gestures implied. The sounds coming out of his mouth were still the same horrific, alien static. I left that day and I haven't been back since. It's been 5 years, and the silence has only grown deeper. I've tried to relearn Italian, real Italian, the kind they speak in Rome or Milan, but my brain rejects it. Every time I try to memorize a word, I feel a sharp, stabbing pain behind my eyes, as if a needle is being driven into my temple. I've started to notice other things, too. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll catch myself making a sound. A click. A hiss. A wet, guttural vibration that comes from deep in my throat. I don't mean to do it. It just happens, like a cough or a sneeze. And when I do it, for a split second, I feel a rush of warmth, a sense of belonging that I haven't felt since I was a child. But then I remember the smell of that kitchen. I remember the way the skin tore away from my father's hand, and the way my mother looked at him with those black, empty eyes. The most terrifying part isn't that I lost my language. It's the realization that the language didn't leave me. It's still there, buried in the meat of my brain, waiting. It's like a parasite that has finished its meal and is now just resting, coiled up in the dark corners of my mind. Every now and then, I feel a twitch in my jaw, or a strange pressure behind my tongue. I think the static I hear when my mother calls isn't a lack of meaning. I think it's the sound of the world without the mask on. And I'm terrified that one day, I won't just hear the static anymore. I'll start to understand it again. And when that happens, I don't think I'll be human anymore. I think I'll just be another mouth for whatever is living under our floorboards to speak through.
Next story.
I don't know if you've ever experienced that feeling when you wake up and for a split second, you don't know where you are. Imagine that, but instead of a room, it's your own skin. It started after the car wreck. The doctors called it prosopagnosia, which is just a fancy way of saying my brain's wiring for faces got fried. I can see a nose, eyes, and a mouth, but my mind refuses to stitch them together into a person. To me, every face looks like a scrambled puzzle where the pieces don't quite fit. Everyone except for him. Living with face blindness is lonely, but you adapt. I learned to recognize my mom by her gait and my girlfriend by the specific way she smelled like vanilla and stale cigarette smoke. But the mirror was the one thing I couldn't trick. I'd stand in the bathroom and look at the shape in the glass, and it was just a void. A meat-colored blur. It's a sickening sensation, looking at your own reflection and feeling like you're staring at a stranger in a crowded subway. To stay sane, I started taping yellow sticky notes to the frame. "This is you," I wrote in thick black marker. "You are 28 years old. This is your face." For a few months, it worked. I'd see the note, I'd see the blur, and I'd move on with my day. But then things started shifting. It began with the eyes. You know how when you look at someone, even if you can't recognize them, you can tell where they're looking? I was brushing my teeth, leaning over the sink, and I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I looked up, and the stranger in the glass wasn't looking at my eyes. He was looking at my throat. I froze. My own reflection was tilted at an angle that didn't match my posture. I moved my head to the left, and there was a slight, sickening delay before the image followed. It was a fraction of a second, but in that moment, the stranger smiled. It wasn't my smile. My mouth was full of toothpaste foam, my lips were tight and stressed, but the man in the glass had a wide, toothy grin that reached his ears. It was the kind of smile you see on a predator right before it lunges. I stopped using that bathroom. I covered the mirror with a towel and tried to pretend it wasn't there. But the house felt different. You know that oppressive, thick atmosphere in a room right before a massive thunderstorm hits? That's how my hallway felt. It was like the air had grown dense and oily. I could feel him watching me through every reflective surface, the microwave door, the darkened television screen, the windows at night. A few nights ago, I had a total breakdown. The isolation of not being able to see a human face, not even my own, finally snapped something inside me. I sat on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, pulled the towel off the mirror, and just sobbed. I was gasping for air, tears streaming down my cheeks, my chest aching with that suffocating grief that makes you want to crawl out of your own body. I looked up, hoping for some shred of self-recognition, some comfort in my own image. The man in the mirror was laughing. He wasn't just smiling anymore. He was doubled over, his shoulders shaking with silent, hysterical mirth. His face, the face I'm supposed to own, was contorted in a way that felt physically impossible. While I was choking on my own salt and sorrow, he was having the time of his life. He pointed a finger at me, mocking my pain. I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers trembling, and as my skin hit the cold surface, his hand met mine. But his fingers didn't feel like glass. They felt like cold, wet leather. He gripped my hand. He actually squeezed it. I jerked back so hard I hit my head on the bathtub. I scrambled out of the room, locking the door behind me, but I could hear it. Not a sound, really, but a vibration. A rhythmic thumping from inside the walls. The next morning, I woke up with a deep, jagged scratch running from my collarbone down to my ribs. It wasn't a thin mark. It was wide, the skin torn back in ragged strips, exposing the raw, red layers of muscle underneath. It didn't smell like iron or pennies. It had this cloying, sickly sweet odor, like a steak that had been left out in the sun for 3 days too long. The bed sheets were soaked, a dark, blossoming stain of crimson that had turned tacky and stiff in the night. I forced myself to go back into the bathroom. I had to know. The sticky note was still there, "This is you." But someone had written underneath it. The handwriting was a perfect mimic of mine, but the words were different. Not for long. I looked into the glass, and the blur was gone. For the first time since the accident, I saw a face with perfect clarity. It wasn't a blur, and it wasn't a puzzle. It was a man with sallow, gray-toned skin and eyes that looked like 2 holes burned into a sheet of paper. He was wearing my shirt, but it was stained with the fluid from the wound on my chest. He wasn't reflecting me anymore. He was standing in a bathroom that looked exactly like mine, but the wallpaper was peeling away in long, wet sheets, revealing something that looked like raw membranes pulsing underneath. He leaned closer to the glass, his nose flattening against the surface. I watched, paralyzed, as he took a razor blade, my razor, and slowly began to slice into his own cheek. I didn't feel the pain immediately. There was a dull, thumping sensation in my jaw, and then I felt the warmth. I looked down into the sink as the bright, vivid red began to spray against the white porcelain. I reached up to my face and felt the opening. My skin had parted, a clean, deep divide that went all the way to the bone. I fell to my knees, clutching my face, trying to hold the pieces of myself together. I could hear him now. He wasn't silent anymore. Through the glass, I heard a wet, bubbling sound, like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of fluid. He was stepping forward, his body pressing so hard against the mirror that the glass began to groan and crack. I've realized now that the prosopagnosia wasn't a brain injury. It was a disconnect. My soul or my identity, whatever you want to call it, was being pushed out to make room. He's been waiting in that space behind the silver for a long time, watching me, learning how to move my limbs, how to mimic my voice, how to wear my life. I'm typing this from my bedroom, but I can see him in the window. The sun is setting, and the glass is becoming a perfect mirror. He's standing there, finished with the razor. He looks perfect. He looks more like me than I ever did. He's adjusting his collar and wiping the stray droplets of red from his chin with a hand that is becoming more solid by the second. The worst part isn't the pain or the blood. The worst part is that I'm starting to fade. When I look at my hands, they're becoming translucent, like a dull fog. I'm becoming the blur. I'm becoming the stranger that no one will recognize. He just turned the doorknob. Not the one in the mirror, the one on my actual bedroom door. I can hear the wood creak. I can smell that sweet, rotting scent filling the room. He's coming to take the last of it. If you're reading this, do me a favor. Go to your bathroom. Look at your reflection. Really look at it. If you see a slight delay in your smile, or if your eyes seem just a little too bright, break the glass. Don't wait. Just break it before he decides he's tired of being the shadow.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.